Episode 101, How to Help Your Child Who is Struggling with Their Faith, with Tina Gosney.
Welcome to Latter-day Life Coaches, the podcast where each episode is a conversation between me, Heather Rackham, and one of my amazing coach colleagues. Each coach here is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and certified through the Life Coach School. Together, we have one main goal, helping you live your best life no matter what. You ready for this conversation with the coach? Here we go.
We often feel like if our child is struggling in the gospel, there is something that needs to be fixed or changed about them. But what if the change you want to see in your children were to come from changing yourself? Coach Tina Gosney feels one of the best ways to help your child in their faith struggles and with their emotions is to be good at handling your own struggles and emotions. When a parent can have control and authority over themselves, they are better able to teach and model that same ability for their children. If you feel like your child might be having faith struggles and you are looking for answers on how to help them, the answer may be looking you back every morning in the mirror. Come listen as Tina talks about how to better control your emotions as a parent and some areas you can develop in yourself which will directly help your child not only in their faith struggle, but all areas of their emotional life.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast today. I get to have Coach Tina Gosney with me today. She's been on before, but we are covering a subject that I think is going to be so applicable to all of us. I'm excited to have her. Tina, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Heather. I'm glad to be here.
It's fun to have you. Tina is one of the few coaches that lives close by to me, and it's always fun to.
We're so lucky we get to see each other in person once in a while.
We do, and even get to visit sometimes about mutual friends that we have. We just discovered a mutual friend that we have, so that's super fun. Anyway, Tina, introduce yourself for us.
So, like Heather said, we are local to each other, and I am a coach who works with parents that have kids that are leaving the church, questioning their faith, and all the relationship issues that go along with that, with their parents, just struggling with fear and wanting to maintain good relationships with their child, but not always knowing how to do that.
Which is something that we all know people, whether it's our own children or our children's friends, that are questioning or leaving. And like you said, as we were talking before we pushed record on this podcast, it seems like we see our youth leaving kind of more when they leave the home. But to your point, there are many signs that we can kind of see while they are still living at home that would be helpful for us to pay attention to as well. But
yeah, I think you're going to actually see them make decisions that take them away from activity or like being active and attending when they leave home and after they turn 18. But most parents are picking up on signs before then. It's not usually a surprise. Totally. I think it's been a little over a year since I heard a statistic, but the last one I heard was that 55+% of our youth are leaving by the time they are becoming adults. And these are kids that were born and raised in the church. So that's more kids that are leaving than are actually staying. Mm-hmm. And I think we can do better. We can do better with our kids. We can do better in helping to understand and build bridges and to answer their questions and just to become parents that are more prepared to help them with the challenges that they're facing.
Which is what we want to talk about today is how to be that parent who is more prepared to have those discussions with our kids or not have those discussions with our kids, depending upon, the relationship we have with them. They may not be willing to speak about it, but there are still things that we can do or not do to help in the situations that are at hand.
Right. And I was telling Heather, the reason that I wanted to focus on this today is because about a month ago, our area, we had 3 stakes that participated in an emotional and mental health conference, which I heard was phenomenal. And they brought in many speakers that not even in the area, but some of them were and some of them weren't. And then the following day, there was a fireside for youth's parents and leaders, and I attended that. And what stood out to me the most was that there was a local therapist here that said, he said, parents, you are trying to clear the road for your child, and you can't actually do that. You need to prepare them for the road, but you're not really even prepared to do that because you need to work on yourself first. And when he said that, it really struck me because I was that parent 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I was trying to clear the road for my kids and not doing as good of a job in preparing them for what they were going to be facing. And it was because I wasn't prepared myself to do that. And have started seeing things happen in my own home, in my own family. And I had to get on board really quickly. But I have spent the last 10 years figuring out what he meant by you need to work on yourself. And so that's what I want to talk. I'm just going to touch on a few of those things today that he might have meant by you need to work on yourself to be able to help your child.
I cannot wait to hear those things, but I am curious first, two things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, the second thing I think we'll talk about, so I won't go there, but the things that our kids are facing. We talk about that a lot. The things our youth are facing, we're not really prepared as parents, you said, to help them with the things that they are facing. What do you think it is specifically that they are facing that we are not prepared to help them with?
The biggest one that I think is the emotions, the emotional problems that are coming up in them. We don't even know how to handle our own emotions. Very, and in a really very real sense, we don't know how to handle our own emotions, and we're not prepared to help them handle those emotions within themselves as well. If that's probably the number one thing I would say.
Yeah. And as it pertains to the church, I think there are things that come up for them emotionally as they have questions and doubts about things in our doctrine. There are emotions that come up for them and they don't know what to do with them. So they start to believe them. They start to believe that, I don't know, that's kind of a conversation maybe for another day, even because there's a lot involved in that. But just helping our kids knowing what to do with those emotions can help them as they ask questions in knowing what to do with those questions and the feelings that come up for them, the emotions that come up as a result of those questions.
Right. And not just in a church sense, but in a life sense.
Right.
Because I think I asked our young women's group, I said, how many of you are feeling like you're suffering with some anxiety or you're dealing with some anxiety? And I think 9 out of 10 hands raised. Yeah. And I was thinking, probably we could have maybe gone 10 out of 10 just from the way that they talk. Most kids these days will tell you that they have anxiety. And along with that, sometimes they say they have depression too. That's just exploded in the last few years, right? That the kids are saying, oh, I have anxiety, or I have depression, or I have depression and anxiety. I mean, those are just words that are common in their vocabulary now, which wasn't even 10 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting. Okay. So I sidetracked just a little bit. I guess I just wanted listeners to see, because I think we do say that we just don't even know what they're facing. And we sometimes wonder, well, what is it that they're facing? Because we aren't always out in the world and well, we are out in the world, but we just don't see and recognize, I think, what it is that they are struggling with, which is part of the problem.
Right. And I think also part of the problem is sometimes we assume that we know what they're struggling with, but we're not always asking them what they're struggling with. And I think also there's times when if we try to ask them, they can't even verbalize what they're struggling with because they're not even mature enough in their own sense of who they are to know what it is that's wrong. They just know that something's wrong.
Yeah. They can feel something inside of them is not quite right. And that's part of that emotions, knowing what to do with the emotions and processing them. I think that's all part of being more in tune and being able to process them and move forward with them. So,
yeah. And if you can connect with your child emotionally, even if they can't put it into words, those are the strongest connections that we have. is when someone feels seen and heard and understood just because you've acknowledged that this is hard and you're having an emotion right now. And let me just be here and sit with you through that.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about this mutual friend that we have before we hit record today. And I said, she is one of the few people that I feel like can genuinely make you feel seen and heard and loved just by having even a small conversation with her. And that's really all we all want, is to feel seen, known, and heard. And that is, I think, a gift that this particular friend of ours has, but we can all nurture that and be better at that. And that is what our youth need. That is what everybody in the world needs, is to feel like they are being understood.
That's a person that you feel safe being around.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So I derailed us, but back to what we were talking about. Okay. I think it all goes together, but
I think it does too. We're good. So I have just a few things that I pulled out of some things that I've talked about lately in my own podcast and in a class that I'm actually creating with a fellow coach that we're going to be teaching in January and February. And so I was trying to pull out, like, what are maybe some of the main things that I could hit in a podcast that was only 30 minutes, because there's really so much that we could talk for 30 hours about this stuff. So if you want more information on these things that I'm talking about, then you can go to my podcast and I talk more about that it's called the Pyramid of Influence series that I'm doing. So just be looking out for those episodes, and that will tell you more about the things that I'm going to talk about today.
And we will link to Tina's podcast in the show notes. So it's easy for everybody to find.
Yeah. Okay. It's called Healing Your Family Relationships, or the Coaching Your Family Relationships podcast. Yeah, I can remember the name of my own podcast.
Oh, good.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the first thing I want you to be aware of is that your brain will have thoughts and it will make assumptions. And we don't have to believe everything that our brain tells us is true, because we get these little handful of facts, and they don't always like fit together, but our brain will just go and fill in the gaps of those and create these stories. And then we think that these stories are true, and we don't actually know that they are, but we think that our kids are thinking a certain way. Like we said before, like we think we know what they're struggling with, but maybe we don't. And we think maybe that something is going on for them, but maybe it's not. We need to really do some information gathering and actual fact gathering, rather than assuming that we know what's going on for our child, and which often will create fear. Because what our brain does is it goes and it fills in those gaps of the facts that we know with just our greatest fears and our greatest insecurities, the things that we're so afraid might happen. That's what our brains are going to tell us that is actually happening. And that causes so much fear. When we react from fear as parents, we can do some real damage to relationships. We can act from control and manipulation and threatening in order to get behavior that we want to have happen, because it seems so scary for us to not see that behavior and the certain things that we want to see them, choices we want to see them making, and maybe they're making different choices. But reacting from that fear can really seriously damage relationships. Sometimes the damage that we can do when we react that way can take months or even years to repair, which
it leaves a lifetime lasting effect, really. Like it's there. You can sometimes work through it, but it's still always there.
Yeah. Yeah. So we need to get a hold of our own fear. And sometimes we do that by questioning whether the thoughts that we're thinking are even true, whether the way that we're framing things and the way that we're looking at things is the way that we need to be looking at them. Maybe we need to reframe the way that we're looking at things, even if the facts are true. It might not mean the things that you think that it means. For instance, we might see our child leaving the church, leaving the faith, making choices that we would never in a million years would want them to make, or maybe had even thought they would make.
Mhm.
But in my own experience, when we assume that that is just dictating their entire future and going to ruin their life, or going to mean that they're going down, like in church vocabulary, like the slippery slope, or
Yes.
or that they're the tares and not the wheat, and like telling yourself things like that, that is not helpful to your relationship with them. It's not helpful for you, the way that you're going to treat them, the way that you think about them. It's also not even true that that might be where they are. They might be in a situation. And I like to think, like, who knows, your child could be like Alma the Younger, that might someday have this experience that they come to know God again. Maybe they need to be going down this road right now that they're going down in order to become Alma the Younger. Who knows if the sons of Mosiah and Alma the Younger would have ever become the people that they were if they hadn't been where they were in the first place, with going around doing the things that they were doing. And we don't exactly even know very much of what they were doing. It was all, it's all kind of a little vague in the scriptures, but sometimes we need to walk a road that will give us experience that we can then turn around and help other people come to God.
Yeah.
But we're not the ones to judge whether our child is who they are. Only God knows that. So
Yeah,
we
and
need
aren't we
to really
grateful?
be careful about the assumptions and the thoughts that we're having about what's happening.
And honestly, as you think about that, what is the upside even into believing those thoughts that will come along, like they're on that slippery slope, or, all the thoughts that can come to our brain? Yes, we can believe them, but believing them, if we think about it, really does not, like you said, help us get anywhere. Our actions, that makes us feel panicky. And then we show up in ways that are not helpful. So yes, some people might think, well, what if it is true? Well, okay, what if it is true? But then believing that thought is really not going to be helpful in getting you anywhere that you want to be with your kids anyway. So
No. And it's not actually our job as parents to judge our children. Right. It's our job to love them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, well, we're going to get into a little bit of that later, but we just sometimes struggle to know what that's supposed to look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we get confused. We think
do
that
get
loving them
confused.
means like taking away their agency sometimes.
Right. And the agency that we fought so hard to get by coming here, right? So the next thing that I see a lot, and I got to tell you, like, so many of these things that I talk about I know them because I lived them myself, because I just struggled with so many of these things and have learned about them and learned a better way, and really done a lot of self-confrontation with myself in these areas. And this is a big one, in that so often we make our child's choices mean something about us. And think about how we do that in good ways. Like, if it means something good about us,
Yes.
right? Like, oh, my child is, we have all my children served missions, or they are all married in the temple. Like, that reflects on us, right? In church yesterday, there was a man who spoke, and they're new in the ward, and he just briefly introduced his family, and they have 2 kids that are out of the house and 2 kids that are still living at home. And he said, we have a daughter on a mission, and then we have a son who's attending school in New York. And I heard him say that, and I know where his child is going, because I've had conversations with him about this. His son is at West Point right now. He didn't say, my son is at West Point. And I was like, okay, that's some humility right there. He could have used his child's going to West Point to get some little brownie points for him, like, a little pat on my back, my son's at West Point, but he didn't do that. But how often do we also make our child's choices mean something about us if it's not something that reflects on us the way that we want it to? Like, none of my children served missions. Well, none of my kids got married in the temple. Like, we don't readily say that to anybody. It's something that we can acutely feel means something bad about us, but we tend to take those. We want our children to provide us with our own sense of sufficiency. This is something that really struck home with me when I was doing, I think it was almost about a year ago. I was doing a podcast with Jennifer Finlayson Fife, and we were talking about parenting, the same thing. And that was something that she said is, parents, you're using your children to provide you with your sense of sufficiency. And you need to stop that. It's not loving. It's not kind, and it's not loving, and it's not fair. And I've really thought about that even more over the last year of like, how do we do that? How do I see people doing that? How do we not do that? How do we give ourselves our own sense of sufficiency rather than relying on something outside of ourselves to give that to us? Because when we rely on our kids to do that for us, that's again, when you're going to see things like, I need to get you to do what I want so that I can feel okay about myself.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's so scary. Most of us don't really know as parents. I think we have made it our kids' job for so many years to help us feel sufficient that we sometimes don't even know that we are sufficient in and of ourselves, right? We haven't even done the work to discover who we are and what is amazing and wonderful because we are who we are. And it's scary to do that. It takes a lot of introspective work. And that's the hard stuff. It's a lot easier to make it be somebody else's job, to try
Absolutely.
to look to our kids to just
Yeah.
make us feel good. But the truth is actually is really hard to be, and we've all tried it. We've all tried to get them to do the things we want them to do so that we can feel better. And it doesn't ever really happen. It's much harder, but it's scary to look within and
Yes.
to do the self-discovery.
It's much, much harder work.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say probably most women do look to outside of themselves to find their own sufficiency. Unless you've been taught and had to directly do this work of validating yourself and finding your own worth, you're probably looking outside of yourself to give that to you. And I was just thinking this morning, like, what are a couple examples of what that might look like? And one that you hear quite often is, oh, well, this family does. This is what this family does. Like, oh, if you're from my own family, well, if you're a Gosney, then you do these things, right? Because that's like, no, if you're going to live up to be in this home so that I can look to you and feel okay, then this is what you're going to be doing. So the times when you say, and I've heard so many parents say like, oh no, this is what our family does. This is how you have to do this to fit into our family. And then there was a client that I had who was really struggling with her son and just some things around that. But she was telling me that a few years ago, he had started saying to her, and he was a teenager at the time, and he was saying to her things like, I'm not going on a mission. And that was the first time she'd ever heard that he'd ever like verbalized that. And she internally was freaking out saying, oh no, you're going on a mission. And she was doing all the things to get him to go to change his mind, right? She was using fear, like, well, the prophet said that you're supposed to go on a mission, using manipulation, control. Well, if you're not going on a mission, that you're not fulfilling your priesthood duty. Or like, everybody in our family has gone on a mission. How can you not go on a mission? And she was pushing all these things onto her son. And the more that she did this, the more he withdrew and stopped talking to her, and even withdrew in other parts of the relationship. And she said they were doing yard work one day, and it was just the two of them. They were out doing the yard, and she was raking leaves, probably about the same time of year. She's raking leaves, and she heard very distinctly of a thought come into her head of, put down the rake and go tell him he doesn't have to go on a mission. And she was like, immediately fear again came into her heart. And she was like, but I can't do that. I can't say that and make it okay for him not to go. And she heard those same words again. And so she put down the rake and asked him to put down his rake. And she just looked at him in the face and she said, you don't have to go on a mission. It's okay. I love you either way. And he just broke down and started sobbing. And she said that was more healing to their relationship than if he had done anything that she had asked him to do. Mm-hmm. And then she found a couple of years later, he came out to her as gay. And then things started to make sense. Like, no wonder he didn't want to serve a mission. No wonder it was so threatening to him when I was saying these things like, no, you have to do this. This is who we are. And he wasn't, it just didn't feel in alignment for him to go on a mission. Not to say that you can't be gay and go on a mission, but for this child, it wasn't in alignment for where he was in his life to do that. So
you said a couple really important things just then.
Okay.
This child and, like for this child and it wasn't in alignment for him. And that is the piece that is so important for all of us to recognize, that each of our children is this child. Each of our children are different and deserving of different relationships, a different parenting, everything is different. And for each in particular child and alignment, each of our children is also going to have an internal compass driving them that is going to be different from everybody else. And to live in alignment with their soul and with who they feel that they are is very important for us to be able to allow them to do.
Yes, because they're God's children first and they're ours second. We just need to be looking at how each one of them are different. Mm-hmm. And when they are telling you something, all behavior is a form of communication, right? So whether it's actions or words or inactions or rolling the eyes or whatever it is, all behavior is a form of communication. But so often when our child is doing something that we think they should be doing something else, like this mom, it's like, no, my child needs to go on a mission, or that means that I have failed. Like that's what she was making it mean. Mm-hmm. If he doesn't go, then I failed. And all those years, all those things that I did, that was a failure. But that's not what it meant. It was just what if she had looked at it like, he's just giving me some information where he is. And if we take information and just look at it without making it mean something about us, we can stay out of murky waters that can really cloud our thinking and our judgment. And for sure, all of us fail at things, especially as parents. Like, I don't know how many times I have failed, but I've also succeeded in a lot of things. And that's actually the way it's supposed to be. We're never supposed to be perfect parents. And there's actually no way that we could have ever been perfect parents. We're supposed to fail in some things and succeed in others. And we just allow our children to have their own life experience and to take in all the information that we're giving them and to assimilate it in their own brains and help them decide what that means about them. They get to decide what that means about them. We don't get to decide that.
We wish that we did.
Yes.
We wish that
we often think that we get to decide that. Yeah, we don't.
Being a parent is so much fun. It really is. It really can be so much more fun than we make it. It's when we hang on to all of these things, these first couple of things that you've talked about, when we make it, when we're not able to communicate and when we hang on to the stories and when we make it mean things about us, it really does make being a parent so much less fun. Mm-hmm. Honestly,
there's a lot of suffering there when we hold on to those things. All of our brains, like when we have think about holding that little baby that's just born and you look at them and you think, I know how your life's going to go. And you have that story written in your head. Like if we don't say it out loud to ourselves, we have it internally just because we think that we know how our lives are going to go and how the lives of our family is supposed to go. Mm-hmm. We have this story written before they even can verbalize anything to us. Yeah. And then when that story gets challenged, it's very, very hard for us because our brains don't want to let go of our original story because it's the story that we loved, the story that we created. But that's not our child's story. They get to write their own story. And for us to allow them to do that sometimes is really hard work. But it's really also vital that we allow them to do that. There's just a couple more things. One thing I touched on at the beginning was that we don't know how to process our own emotions. And so we don't really know what to do with our kids' emotions either. I mean, if you think about maybe you were parented the way most parents were parented, like how our parents parented us. I hope I'm making sense right now. But like when you were a child, like how were you told to handle your emotions? Most of us were told like, go to your room until you can get over it. You're causing problems. Stop doing that. It was
Buck
not
up.
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, it was not okay to have emotions, right?
Yeah.
And so we don't know how to deal with our own emotions, and we don't for sure know how to allow our kids to have their own. And sometimes it feels like if you validate their emotions, that you're just going to reinforce that it's okay to just fall into them and become a mess in all those emotions. But actually, it does the opposite. When we can validate someone's emotions, it just, like we said at the beginning, it allows them to feel seen and heard and understood. And that helps them to process those emotions and to work through them. When we don't get to process them, they just kind of stay there. They just stay inside of our bodies, inside of our brains, and they start creating and feeding more on themselves and just taking us to really unhealthy places as we just feel so terrible within ourselves. And we just often want to get rid of the way that we're feeling. And sometimes we do really unhealthy things to be able to get rid of those feelings. But processing emotions is a really important thing for you to learn how to do on your own, because when you process your fear, when you process your sadness, grief, fear, disappointment, you process all of those things. You don't unload them onto the people in your life. Mm-hmm. You don't unload them onto your child and make it their responsibility for them to be different so that you can feel better. You know how to deal with your own emotions and you take responsibility for them. And then when you know how to do that, you can show your child how to do that same thing. And if they don't want you to teach them how to do that, you just show them by example, which is a greater teacher anyway than actually speaking, is showing by example how to do these things.
People will often ask me, what does that even mean to process your emotions? What does that look like? And
Right.
That's a whole other
It's a whole other podcast
episode.
Yeah.
But I think the very first thing you can do in processing emotion is just even labeling what it is that you're feeling. We're so bad at that. We don't even, we'll probably say like, we'll give ourselves like 5 choices: happy, mad, sad, glad. Those are the ones that we go to. Angry, maybe. But just learning to be specific. Oh, I'm feeling this right now. Just being able to label what you are feeling, even if like pull up a list of emotions and try to get really specific. And it's amazing what happens when you just express to yourself, oh, I'm feeling this emotion right now. And that in and of itself is very simple, but does a whole lot.
Yes. It's kind of amazing how much help that does, actually. Yeah. I have just remembered I have a podcast that I talked all about processing emotions. So we can actually link that in the show notes too, where I walk you through how to process emotions. What does that look like? And what does it not look like? So
awesome.
That's a great thing that I just resourced for you that's available. We need to learn, if nothing else, just learn how to get grounded. So often something happens, we get really triggered. We feel all of a sudden like we're not in control of ourselves. Just learning how to ground yourself is super important too. And it helps you get out of that fight or flight or freeze, really reaction that is so damaging. Because then if you're in that type of state, in that fight, flight, or freeze, your higher brain is offline. You're actually not doing anything productive to the situation when you're just in survival mode and your higher brain is offline. So learning to ground yourself, especially in moments that you get really triggered and you feel like sometimes you get gut punched, it feels like emotionally by your child, learning how to ground yourself does a lot of help there too. I talk about that also in the processing emotions, how to get grounded. There's another thing that I think is super important. And I often hear parents ask me, like, how am I supposed to love my child without condoning what they're doing? And I think that question in itself is just the wrong question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that that is something that's even our job to condone or to not condone. It's just our job to love. And think about if your child is leaving the church, leaving the faith, struggling with their faith, they're probably struggling to see God in their lives. They're probably struggling to find love from Him. They're probably struggling to see what does, like, even having a relationship with Him or with Jesus Christ, what does that mean? And how do I even do that? I don't even know. And you, as their parent on this earth, you are the closest thing that they have on this earth to represent Him. And so if you are not showing them unconditional love, if you're not showing them patience and kindness and understanding and trying to make a safe space for them to work things out, they're not going to be able to find God as easily. You're probably making it harder for them to have a relationship with Him if you're not reflecting that unconditional love that He would have for them. And unconditional love is often so misunderstood when we talk about that, because then the next question is almost always, well, I just can't get behind what they're doing. Well, unconditional love does not always say yes. It doesn't have to agree. It doesn't have to say whatever you want and just be really indulgent. That is not unconditional love. Unconditional love means I accept you right now for who you are, no matter if you ever changed or not. I love you completely. And you are always worthy of being in my life and in this family. But sometimes love says no. Sometimes as parents, we need to say no, but we still do it with that in the background, always. Never threatening the relationship. The relationship should never be on the table. We should always be choosing the relationship, but always asking yourself, what is the best thing for this child right now? What looks the most like love that I could do right now in this situation? And working from that mind frame will help you to get a lot closer to unconditional love so that you might be able to reflect that love that God has for them so that they can see Him better through you.
Yeah. And sometimes the most like love does sound like no. It can mean many different things, but that is such a great framework to work from and to think that and keep that in the back of our mind.
Yeah. I don't think often that we realize that that is what's happening with our kids when we're trying to get them to change and we're reacting from fear and all of the things that we do, right? That's not how God would be treating them.
Mm-hmm.
And so they struggle more to find Him when we react that way. So when we can keep our own selves in check and hold steady that unconditional love for them, it just makes things easier for them to be able to work out and to be able to find Him when they're ready.
This has been such a great conversation, chock full of things that we can all take and implement into our life. And ultimately, that is what we want, is for each of our kids to have a relationship with Heavenly Father, Heavenly Mother, and our Savior, Jesus Christ. And being the person who exemplifies them, who shows love, is really what we want. We get it confused sometimes, but that's what it is being the people that show up in love all the time. That is the gospel of Jesus Christ, is love.
Yes. And let's just put our kids aside for a minute. When we look at what we're supposed to be going through on this earth, our own development, it's so much more for us than it is for them. We are becoming, through this process of working on ourselves, struggling with a child who isn't doing what we think they should be doing, or actually maybe sometimes doing the opposite of what we want them to be doing. Like working through that within yourself is you working on your natural man. It's like Heavenly Father giving you this. Sometimes He gives you these little opportunities every day to work on your natural man. And then every once in a while, they give you this big giant one that they're going to dump in your lap and say, okay, here you go. Here's a big challenge where you get to work on your natural man. And that is returning love for hate. Our natural man wants to return hate for hate. Although I think that hate in our families, we use that with family relationships, especially parent and child, can be like a really triggering word. But returning love for anything other than love being given to us is what we want to be doing with all of our relationships. And that is us working out our natural man.
And that's all Heavenly Father, Heavenly Mother are doing for us. They are always giving us the love that we deserve. It's always love for love. It's never anger or
punishment.
I mean, or punishment, that's the word, because sometimes maybe maybe there is some anger, sometimes love. I don't know, but it's not punishment. It's not like you deserve something bad, evil for evil, or the things that we tend to think of in our mind. But anyway, Tina, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We will link to all of these things in the show notes, Tina, and your podcast. And where can they find you aside from the podcast?
Yeah, I don't drop into social media very often, but you can always DM me through Facebook at Tina Gosney Coaching or on Instagram at Tina Gosney Coaching. I probably am more available through just my email, tina@tinagosney.com. So that's probably the best place to get me.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for all these tips that you've given us today. And may we all continue working on ourselves so that we can be the people that our youth need, and we can help them on their journey as much as they are helping us on ours.
Yes. Thanks for letting me share today, Heather.
Hey, we just wanted to thank you for spending part of your day here with us at Latter-day Life Coaches and being part of this conversation. Share this with your friends so that you can have a conversation with them on this topic as well. And as always, subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Have a good one, my friends.